Because we have names attached to these famous saints and martyrs, and they suck up all the oxygen in the room, so to speak. So if you try to name several early Christians, you can probably name people like Augustine or Ambrose or Antony, various other church fathers, desert fathers and mothers, and so on. But that's like a tiny, minuscule proportion of who the early Christians were. By that calculation, the 3rd century is the really crucial century. That's where, over the course of that century, we go from a fraction of 1% of the empire are Christians to almost 10% of the empire are Christians.
Hello, and welcome to the Upwards podcast. I'm Dan, one of your hosts, and today I'm talking to Nadya Williams, author of Cultural Christians in the Early Church, a book that looks at the connection between the ancient church, the early church, and modern day Christianity, and the way that both communities of Christians really dealt with a lot of the same temptations and struggles with cultural sin. Nadya is a historian of ancient Rome and also someone who writes for magazines and news outlets today. And so she brings together her interest in modern Christianity and her expertise in ancient Christianity to give us an insight into the, you could say, universal struggles that Christians deal with whenever they're in culture, which means all Christians everywhere. Well, it's good to be back on the Upwards podcast. I'm here with Nadya Williams. Hi, Nadya. How are you doing? We're here to talk about a recent book you wrote. It's with Zondervan, called Cultural Christians in the Early Church, a historical and practical introduction to Christians in the Greco-Roman world. So, really interesting title. Can you give us just a sense of what background do you have studying this? What did you get your PhD in? Expertise are you bringing to the topic?
Yeah. So my PhD is in classics, so Greco-Roman, everything. It's an interdisciplinary field, and the focus is on studying the languages and the cultures and everything around. But I also came to Christ a few years after completing my PhD program. And so in this book, it's kind of bringing together both my professional training, but also my reflections and conversations with students and people at church over the years.
So I think many Christians are interested in the early church era. It's sort of one of the eras that no matter what tradition you land in Christianity, you have interest in the origins and the New Testament in particular. What made you want to write a book on the early church and so what are the origins of this particular focus on cultural Christians?
A lot of it came from conversations with students. I was teaching at the time in the Bible Belt. So a lot of my students were churched, but also people at my church. And there seemed to be this over-idealization of the early church. That people back then were so much better than we are, much better Christians. You know, it cost you something to profess Christianity, unlike us today, where it's just kind of comfortable. You wake up on Sunday, you could go to church, or, you know, if you sleep in this once, that's okay. Jesus understands. But the whole point, what I'm trying to say is culture is a little bit more insidious than that. You live in it. You can't tell where it ends and the gospel begins sometimes. And so even in the early church, and that's kind of the shocking argument that I'm making here, that even in a world where it costs you something to profess Christianity, people could be swayed by culture and not even realize it. So a lot of the people that I'm talking about are not necessarily saying like I'm rebelling, but it just happens.
In a lot of the same ways we might think about cultural Christianity today in American culture or something like that. Is that
exactly.
Is that the thinking, sort of drawing a parallel between that situation and the contemporary moment?
Exactly. Yes. I've really appreciated the image that historian Chris Shannon makes of culture as secondhand smoke. It's like you don't even feel it. Like you don't smell it after a while, but it clings to you. And that's a really kind of poignant image as opposed to the aroma of Christ that we want to be.
Right. Can you, just before getting into the cultural Christianity part, do you have any thoughts on why early Christianity, why lay Christians have such a positive view? I mentioned just briefly that maybe it's because that's like a shared part of the broader Christian world, is most churches, you know, root themselves in the first century and all that. But I agree with you. It's a prevalent view among lay Christians that there's an idealized version of the early church. Why do you think that is?
Because we have names attached to these famous saints and martyrs, and they suck up all the oxygen in the room, so to speak. So if you try to name several early Christians, you can probably name people like Augustine or Ambrose or Antony, various other church fathers, desert fathers and mothers, and so on. But that's like a tiny, minuscule proportion of who the early Christians were. And so the people that I'm looking at in this book are really the nameless multitudes who become the cautionary tales in stories that Paul writes about in his letters or various sermons, speeches, treatises, and so on. So the nameless multitudes give us a very different picture, but perhaps because they're not associated with really famous kind of names that we know. They're not household names. It's easier for us to kind of brush them aside. It's like you see them, but you don't really.
Right. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense that the only ones we really know about or invoke are the all-stars, so to speak, from the early church. And so it's a distorted view if you think they represent everybody. Okay. So cultural Christians, one term you use in the book is cultural sin. And I wondered if you could just, sort of think with me, what's the difference between a cultural sin? What other types of sins are there, I guess? And how is a cultural sin different than a non-cultural sin?
So what I'm trying to present with this particular term is what kind of sins do you commit simply by acting in accordance with culture rather than anything else? Like predominantly, if you just follow the cultural teachings on something like food or marriage and sexuality and whatever else, you arrive at cultural sins.
Can you give us just a few of the main ones you cover in the book?
Yeah. So I start with Ananias and Sapphira as representatives of cultural attitudes to money and property. I look at food. I look at views on sexuality and gender. I look at apostasy. Just kind of each chapter looks at a particular category. We end with Christian nationalism and also just trying to quit church. Can I be a Christian, but, just leave the church?
So obviously those have some resonance, or at least some of those have more resonance. Maybe the food is less resonant today, though maybe you have thoughts on that. Maybe food. In fact, I remember you talk about Chick-fil-A as one way to think about food in the modern context. But I think of other ones like maybe Christian nationalism feels very contemporary, right? That's a term that is bandied about a lot now when we're talking about American Christianity. Just trying to get behind the scenes of it as a writer, did you have like what went into saying, I'm going to call this Christian nationalism versus, I don't know, something that would maybe be more neutral or more, I don't know how, I guess nationalism is a hard term to think about what in the 4th century, what equals nationalism. But anyway, what went into thinking about how to sort of frame some of these that have both ancient and contemporary resonances?
And that's a great question because some of it does feel a little bit anachronistic, and that is a danger. But what I wanted to do was direct my readers to think back to where we fit in with the early church, kind of draw the parallels. Really, there are two types of ancient historians. Those who emphasize just how different everything in the modern world is from antiquity, and those who try to draw those parallels and say, actually, there's a lot more that's similar, the human experience. And the latter is what I'm trying to do in this book. And so I was trying to use terminology that is familiar to us to describe phenomena that are really similar. Not identical, but similar enough to give us pause, productive pause. And with Christian nationalism, that of course is, Augustine would never use that term.
Right.
And yet when you look at what falls under that umbrella today, and what Augustine is warning against, the parallels are really prominent. And this is one of those things where also it was very beneficial to talk with historians who do study this. So John Wilsey was instrumental in talking about nationalism. What is nationalism? He read that chapter in draft form, and we had a long conversation on what is responsible to do here and what is not.
Right. And there's something about there's a deeper question at stake, whether it's nationalism or pro-empire or whatever. There's a deeper question of sort of where you put your values and your loyalty, or sort of how you understand yourself as an individual in relation to this broader organization or institution. And I think that's probably what ties it all together. That's more of a universal experience that can bridge the the centuries, I guess.
Yeah. And that kind of gets at this larger question for historians, because some people get a lot more cautious than I am and just kind of emphasize that every single period, every single event is kind of is unique and we cannot draw those parallels. And I get that. But at the same time, I think we're missing the potential for understanding our own place in this like longer arc of history, especially as Christians, because we do have that connection to the early church, kind of the spiritual DNA going back then.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe one other area that you could say is different from today and early church era is something I'm interested in as I study U.S. history, which is, mass culture or pop culture. Like there's just technologies and ways of developing, of producing culture that are pretty modern, I guess you could say. And there's been a lot of critique by theologians, by others, that American Christians in particular are formed much more by popular culture, maybe popular religious culture or just popular culture in general, than they are by their Christian tradition. And that seems like a really important topic to talk about in the contemporary context. I wondered, is there like a ancient is there something that's approximate to popular culture in the way we talk about it now? Was there maybe I'm trying to fill in the blanks even as I'm asking. Was there like a Star Wars, Harry Potter type cognate for early church where this was actually a really formative part of how they understood values in the world that they also had to struggle against as early Christians, much like we talk about how Christians need to guard against those things today?
That's a good question. And I guess the classicist answer, how the Sunday school answer is always like, it's all about Jesus. The classicist answer, it's all about Homer. So that's kind of the common value that undergirds all of antiquity. So you look at the Homeric values, the heroism, and everybody wants to be the epic hero in their story. And we see that even with the early church. So when Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, calls out some members of his congregation who apparently did not want to serve the sick and the dying during a plague because they wanted to save themselves from martyrdom. And he says, like, that's a problem. But the value that those particular Christians were reflecting was very Homeric. Like, we want to die like saints and martyrs. That's Homeric heroes of the early church.
Right. So they are, okay. So this is getting into sort of how a lot of the chapters go. So they are, what would you say? Are they conflating Greco-Roman values with Christian values and thinking they're Christian when they're actually acting non-Christian? Or are they not understanding how Christianity should sort of certain Christian values should pervade their day-to-day life? Like what's the disconnect there? What's happening there?
I think there's a little bit of both, but the conflation part is a lot of what I'm pointing out in this book, and it's very difficult for people to discern the boundary because you're thinking like, well, of course it's a good value to die as a martyr, but what are your motivations in that particular example yet again? Right.
If you're enjoying the topics and people on the Upwards podcast, you might be interested in attending an event at Upper House. To see what's coming up, head to upperhouse.org/events. Okay, one thing I wanted to make sure to talk about are the sources. So as a historian, you're obviously relying on accounts of these long ago eras, and I think it was interesting. You used obviously a number of early church sources, but also non-Christian sources, you could say, to get at what Christians were doing. Just talk to us about how a classicist thinks about. We were talking yesterday that I'm a modern historian, so someone who studies the 20th century. It's often there's way too many sources, and you have to sort of decide what am I actually going to focus on. And it seems like it's often the opposite problem for a pre-modern historian, where you have very few things. You got to read between the lines, or you really got to extract everything you can from them. So I imagine you were doing a lot of that work for this book.
Yes. So there's definitely a lot of value in using Greek and Roman literature, but also we have a lot of inscriptions and papyri. So that would be the closest parallel that I would draw to the archival sources that you use. So with papyri, for instance, we have lots and lots of documents from especially Egypt, various letters, legal documents, agreements, and so on. And we're able to kind of see a picture of everyday life of people. So, for example, in the chapter on Christian violence in Egypt, I looked at a lot of those papyri. We have village police documents and so on, like showing us like what is it like to live every day in this particular society. But also when we think about just kind of documents for everyday people, inscriptions, especially funerary inscriptions, are perhaps like the most common type that we have from the Roman Empire. So it's kind of funny where you know almost nothing about a person, but you have a name and kind of just their gravestone. Like here's a summary of a life in that form. And it gives us information that's valuable.
And are there times where the sources conflict or contradict each other? I imagine accounts of Christians by pagans or non-Christians would at least emphasize different things than Christian self-representation. How do you adjudicate sort of when sources are conflicting or saying things that don't line up?
It's usually more like the different emphasis or misunderstanding in the pagan sources. So, for example, a chapter on apostasy, I was really excited to find documents on the same church, the general kind of province of Bithynia, both from a Roman source, the governor Pliny the Younger, and from Christian sources. And so it was really fascinating to read Pliny's famous letter about the Bithynian church and finding Christians in his province and try to understand, how much does a pagan governor know about Christianity in 111 AD? Mm-hmm. And it turns out not a whole lot. And this is a very educated Roman, and he's very highly confused, and he's done his research, and he's kind of freaking out to the emperor in this letter, and it's all preserved. So it's fascinating to get those kinds of glimpses and then to kind of line it up with the Christian sources that we have, like 1 Peter.
Right. Okay, so actually that's a good transition point to get to some maybe more foundational questions. Could you just talk about what is Roman culture? So if these are cultural Christians, they're sort of in this Greco-Roman culture. What are the main values of Greco-Roman culture in this period? And this period, by the way, we're talking about basically the 1st to the 4th century or so. I don't even know if you can summarize that as a single period, but I'll leave that to you. But what is the Roman culture that Christians are really a part of?
So imagine a world where people are all ranked. This is a very hierarchical society where every individual knows their place in that society. And that's really true, not just in the Roman world, but any ancient pagan culture. There's a famous vase from Mesopotamian city of Uruk, a Barca vase. And it's this band after band kind of ordering the world. At the top, you have the gods, then you have people and all of that. And so you get this idea of everybody knows their place, and that is just natural, the natural order of things, how they should be, or else the gods will be upset. And so in the Roman world, what it means is every single person knows their place, and some people are more important and more valuable than others. And what it adds up to is horrific abuse of some categories of people by other categories of people. And so for Christianity to come along and suddenly say, well, every single human being is precious because made in God's image, becomes a really offensive idea because it challenges not only the emperor, it challenges the whole Roman Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods on which the Roman Empire is supposed to rest.
And it also challenges Roman religion, I guess,
big time.
Directly. Mm-hmm. So talk about what is Rome's, I mean, we most of us know it was polytheistic, pagan, but what was Rome's religion? What was the point of the religion, that it played in Roman culture?
It again played that role of reinforcing everything, reinforcing that peace with the gods, reinforcing order. It's a very comfortable kind of world where, again, if you know the rules, everything makes sense. And Christians overturn the rules. And it's so much more than just challenging the polytheism. Again, it's also challenging the human rules of how the empire is structured, who is significant, who is not, who should interact with whom, who should share a table with whom, and so on. So just everything, when you look at Christianity from, the different categories that I consider, sharing wealth and so on. For example, in the Roman world, there's no safety net. Why? Because again, if some people are not important, it does not matter if they starve. And so on. When you look at a society that's based on this kind of cruelty, what we would call cruelty, but the Romans did not.
And this, I think one of the interesting things was just how much Roman religion pervaded society in a way. Yes. It wasn't, maybe in an American context, you might think of a wall of separation and that religion has this one place, role to play in a private sphere, and then the rest of society is secular or something like that. But it's almost the opposite, I guess, in Roman culture. So talk a bit about how Roman religion sort of played into even the way you functioned in society.
That's such a modern concept, by the way, like what we have in the U.S., the idea of separation of church and state. So even a couple of centuries ago, in a lot of countries, that did not exist. Right. So it should not surprise us that in the ancient world, that did not exist. So for the Romans, every concept of their, like every way they told their history went back to the god's favor in founding the city of Rome, then the second king of Rome, whether he existed or not, Numa Pompilius creates this pax deorum, like starts this idea of this formal peace with the gods that's predicated on the idea that like as long as the Romans serve the gods will make the city prosper. But then the Romans have this idea of like, well, whenever something does not go well, clearly the gods are upset, and there's a complicated system of priestly colleges and expiation procedures. There are also these Sibylline books that are brought out in times of like extreme distress. So kind of last resort, we will consult the Sibylline books, which are just like total gibberish. But, at that point, like if you've just had a horrific military defeat, might as well consult them and see if they can help out. So there are layers and layers of religious observances and rituals. Some are really bizarre, like, circumambulation of the city multiple times, like walk around the city multiple times, with particular like special clothing, special sacrifices. There are just so many different things. The Roman historian Livy, who was writing during the Augustan age, he's one of our main sources for early Roman history. And what he writes is a narrative that's year by year. And at the end of each year, you've reached the end of a year in Livy's narrative because he says, here are the notable omens and portents that occurred that year. So you get a really nice list. And some of them are just really bizarre. Like for several years during the Republic, there were rains of stones that fell on the city. It's like, what do you do with this? But a lot of that was also, it seems like the Romans were using it imperialistically. Like if an omen occurred close to the city, well, it means we need to conquer that area. And it's really part of the gods are telling us to keep expanding. So there's very much this imperialistic kind of aspect to it. An omen I mentioned in the book occurred right after the Romans captured Veii, a prominent city, Etruscan city. And they asked the goddess Juno, who was the patron goddess of Veii, like, hey, Juno, you want to come to Rome? And apparently the cult statue nodded her head. She's willing to come to Rome. So the Romans very much have this idea of religion as kind of the gods on their side, working with them. With all of that baggage, you can imagine how shocking Christianity was, even after Constantine. So when Augustine is writing about the fall of Rome in 410, he is responding not only to Christians who are shocked at this capture of the city, but also to pagans who are asking him, like, Christians did this. Can't you see?
Right. That's really interesting. I wonder if we could jump to other main actor, I guess. If we have Roman culture and Roman society, there's the church. And so just set us up for what is the early church? Like what are the numbers we're talking about? Obviously there's growth over the period you're looking at. But, I think we know, most Christians know just based on the books in the epistles that there are these certain cities that have Greco-Roman sounding names where the early churches are. But, how do you think about the early church in relationship to this broader society, maybe on like a sociological level?
So a lot of it, is very difficult for us to tell because Roman demographics are really difficult. Right. Perhaps the best source that I've relied on is Rodney Stark, the sociologist who has done some modeling trying to kind of calculate the growth of the early churches. And so by that calculation, the 3rd century is the really crucial century. That's where over the course of that century, we go from a fraction of 1% of the empire are Christians to almost 10% of the empire are Christians, which is just astounding. Yeah. But before that, what we're looking at is just those local church plants that are growing very quietly. And then the question is, what happened in the 3rd century? And in the 3rd century, what happened is something like kind of, just imagine our 2020 magnified over the course of a century. I mean, that really is what it feels like. So the third century crisis that Roman historians talk about, you have massive turnover of emperors, like civil war for about 50 years straight, where emperor after emperor keeps getting assassinated. Every now and then we find a coin and realize like, oh, there was another emperor at one point during that year. Like that actually happens that we didn't know existed, who lived just long enough to like mint some coinage and then got assassinated. Okay. So just really serious turmoil. And also there's inflation because emperors starting with Caligula were debasing coinage, like reducing gold and silver content. Well, finally in the third century that hits economy. And this is the period also when we get the first empire-wide persecutions of Christians. Before that, the persecutions were all localized. And finally, right around 250, a mysterious pandemic arrives in the empire and it continues to circulate for about 20 years, and has an estimated fatality rate of 70% for those who catch it. Wow. I mean, it's insane. So like, imagine that. And that's the period when the church explodes.
We want to let you know that this episode is also available in audio only. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and then you'll be notified every time there's a new episode. Right. Can you just explain why are the first empire-wide persecutions during this third century? What changes between, or is it just the growth and now Christianity seen as a bigger threat with like a bigger minority religion, or is there something else going on as well?
I'm not entirely sure. It could be the growth. It could be just one of those kind of appealing yet again to Pax Deorum, that like this is a threat to the peace with the gods. But the very first one, the persecution of the Emperor Dacius, he's not even around very long. I mean, he basically comes to power, has a persecution. He's not in the picture for longer than a couple of years, and that's it. So a lot of that turmoil simply seems to affect the Christians worse than everybody else around them.
Your book is structured into 3 parts that are chronological, and I'm just wondering, in a broad sense, like does the I think I know your answer to this, but does the threat or the tendency toward cultural sin lessen as the church grows? Like as the church becomes more of its own subculture, you could say, where maybe in theory they could foster more distinctly Christian values that maybe in an earlier time there were just so few Christians that it was harder to do that. Do you see any correlation there, or is it just as, my guess is yes, but is it just as tempting to be sinning culturally in the 4th century in the same ways as it was in the 1st century?
I think we would all love for the answer to be, it's like, yes, as the empire became more Christian, it was so much better. And the answer is no. Right. Cultural Christians are simply like slightly different. So that's what happens when you have more of a Christian kind of empire. You simply have different ways in which people figure out how to be sinners.
Right. And yeah, and I don't even think I was thinking about the change of the empire itself. I was thinking, so I wanted to just get your take on a book I just finished reading by Alan Kreider called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, which just happens to align topically with this. I'm reading it for a church group. But Kreider in that book emphasizes the important role of what he calls habitus, which he borrows from a sociologist. But this idea that one thing that sets the church apart is that there becomes this distinct way of life that is practiced among the church. And it's actually one of his emphases is that it's really hard to get into the church. He spends a lot of time emphasizing the difference between, say, a very modern evangelistic drive or revival where you're just trying to, you're in that mode, just trying to get people to pray a prayer or sort of identify as Christian. And in the early church, as Kreider talks about, it was actually quite difficult. You had to go through often years before you would get baptized, and you had to be catechized in this very particular way. And I think his argument was that allowed Christians to actually somehow contain some of the cultural sin because of the thickness of the habitus over time. It wasn't just like a mental assent to certain things. It was actually you were in community practicing distinct ways of living. Kreider also thinks things get worse as time goes on, or at least don't get better. I don't know if he thinks they get worse as much, but they don't get better. So I'm not saying that he does think that over time it's easier to be a Christian or something like that. But there does seem to be something about like if you get to a critical mass, does it matter as a Christian, like that you can surround yourself with Christians? Does that somehow help with cultural sin, or does it not? I don't know.
I think the nature of the sin simply changes. And that's where like the Donatist controversy is so fascinating, because you get suddenly like Christian on Christian violence of the sort that could not have existed before. But also, I appreciate Kreider's argument. And I think to some extent it also explains the explosive growth of the church in the 3rd century, that seeing the habitus of those communities would have been attractive to pagans around, where you have people who are willing to serve, to be sacrificial at a time when the crisis around. And people are dying from the plague. But at the same time, also, like, there are certain categories he mentions that I think were not necessarily as significant. So the idea that, like, well, it took years to get into the church, that's true. But we have saints who were catechumens who never actually officially got to that final stage of like acceptance into the church, like Perpetua and Felicity. And their stories are really significant.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking about the modern context and thinking about how this relates. Again, we're here on a university campus. One of the ways that many Christians talk about culture is through sort of elite culture or through ideas, and the ways that bad ideas can sort of affect one's Christianity or one's beliefs. And I just don't know enough about ancient Rome to know, is there an equivalent to like academic culture or elite culture that was something that Christians were susceptible to trying to adopt ideas from, or in order to be more respectable or something within their culture? Was that something they or at least some of them struggled with?
Maybe. Perhaps easiest parallel that comes to mind is Augustine and how he writes about Christian approach to history versus the pagan approach to history. The idea that the way pagans think of history puts Rome at the center, whereas for Augustine, it's God's story. The focus shifts. The information is largely the same, but the way you frame the question is going to get you to a very different answer.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
It's not just about research. Like today we have this idea, and I think Augustine is trying to get at that point too, that we have the facts and we think the facts are going to tell you the story. Well, it's like, they're not. You still have to plug the facts into a framework. Right.
And that for Augustine, for the Christians, was the sort of biblical narrative, or sort of trying to plug it into a much more cosmic story about God's relationship with humanity, redemption of creation.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of the most compelling characters I thought in the book was Cyprian, and
I'm so happy to hear that.
Okay,
that's my favorite.
Okay, well, tell us about him. Who was Cyprian, and why is he your favorite?
So I first came across his sermon on the plague in summer 2020 when we were all thinking about plagues. Funny that. Yeah. So it's an interesting story. So he's from Carthage, same city where Perpetua and Felicity were martyred in the early 3rd century. And he was born right around that time. And we don't know a whole lot about his early life, but at some point in his 40s, he converts to Christianity. We don't even know exactly what happened, but he comes to Christ, and his talents for rhetoric are immediately recognized as a good fit for the local church. He becomes bishop. So he's promoted very fast. And just about that time, we get the persecution of Decius, the first empire-wide persecution, and the pandemic breaks out. And through all of this, he is writing. So we have a ton of his letters, actually not a ton, it's more like 80-something letters that he writes as part of his ministry. And he's just a really compassionate, thoughtful pastor. With a lot of ancient bishops, like somebody like Augustine, you read their sermons or their letters and you think, like, this is a really wonderful theologian. I don't think I would want to be in his church. With Cyprian, you get a sense of, like, this was a really genuinely loving, compassionate pastor who cared for his flock so deeply and would have been just a wonderful leader for the local church. And he was, it seems like, by all accounts. And he wrote a number of treatises. So in addition to the letters, we on various particular situations, we have his treatises, what seems like started out as a sermon on the plague that eventually circulated also as a treatise, and so on. And he is eventually martyred in a persecution.
Yeah, he just struck me as someone who, was a leader at a very difficult time and seemed to keep the priority where, at least from my perspective, it should have been. So he seemed like a very admirable leader of the church in that sense. Very good. Okay. Just a few more questions. I wondered, was there a surprising chapter in here? What was the most surprising chapter, the most surprising sin, I guess, you saw that was pervasive in the early church?
That's a good question. Perhaps the Desert Fathers, because we think of them as saints. I mean, they are saints from a Catholic perspective, and yet reading their stories and seeing time and time again that the assumption that again seems so logical that if you remove yourself from company with all these sinful people, you would be so much better on your own. And the answer is, well, not exactly. So you have Desert Fathers who say like, well, I've been alone for 20 years and I still struggle with anger. It's like, well, okay. I guess human nature, it really is a sinful one.
If you're enjoying this episode of the Upwards podcast, please rate, like, and subscribe so that you're notified every time a new episode drops. And just for the background, Desert Fathers, what period are we talking about?
We're talking 4th century on.
Was there any prehistory to the Desert Fathers? Were there people who tried to do this type of ascetic living in the 1st century, 2nd century, or is it more of a later development?
Even earlier, we have some pagan ascetics, so people like Diogenes who tried to kind of, So you have people who try to live the ascetic life, even like in late classical Athens, and just it's associated with the philosophical kind of school, the thought that you would do better for yourself if you separated yourself from luxury and kind of everyday expectations of humanity. And yet it turns out that those trappings of civilization kind of keep us accountable to each other.
Right.
In good ways.
Right. Is there, on the flip side, was there a chapter, a cultural sin that seemed most relatable to the modern moment or to the contemporary moment? Something that, I don't know, struck you as, oh yeah, things really don't change over time?
I think the food one, really.
Okay.
Just the way we think about food is... So for Christianity, of course, like the way we talk about the Lord's Supper, sharing the table, hospitality, like all of those values. And yet there are so many little things that seep in. So I talk, for example, about evangelical attitudes to alcohol shift over the last 20 years or so.
Right.
Where it used to be a taboo and now it's in a lot of the reform circles. It's now perfectly acceptable. And the question is like, well, was it a sin 20 years ago and it's not now? Or is it cultural? And that's kind of an obvious one. It's like, yeah, this is a cultural shift in evangelicalism.
Right. And then we teased it early on, but how does Chick-fil-A as sort of a symbol in food intersect with American Christian culture now?
So I was looking at all of the memes that exist about Chick-fil-A. There are a lot out there. Like if you Google that this is the Lord's chicken or the Lord's calories don't count. Things like that were I wish that were true.
Right.
But the whole point that we take something that is very much a modern cultural idea, particular fast food, which has a specific role in American society today, and we try to apply Christian ideals to it. And it gets funny.
Right. Okay. Last question. What's the one takeaway you're hoping readers gain from your book? What are you hoping the thing that they remember when they forget all the details and maybe all the specifics? What's the lesson you want them to take away from the book?
Pursue sanctification. That it's a process. This is something that you're not going to just you're not going to be better off if you leave aside all these sinful people that fill churches, because guess what? You're one of them.
Excellent. Well, I'm speaking with Nadya Williams. The book is Cultural Christians in the Early Church. Nadya, thank you for the book and thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.